February 28th. And on Sunday is May 1, the 19th anniversary of Roseanne and Robert Anderson. That's a long time. And love has flown. The coop more than once. Anyway, I was born 1921, September the 5th, in the big city of Kennett, Missouri. I was one of those rare babies born in the hospital because my grandfather, John T. Mackey, was an attorney, and no attorney could have his grandson born at home. Mom and Dad were fighting, therefore Mother had gone home to live with Dad, her dad, and my dad was in Holcomb, which was 14 miles away. And it was 40 years later until I learned that I had been born Baby Doe Anderson. And then I had to send a certificate in, notarized, proving that I was Robert L. Anderson. The reason being that in the hospitals they had to name you within 10 days. And if they didn't, they just sent out the certificate anyway. But anyway, my dad, John T. Anderson, notice that's Jonti, Vader, V-A-T-E-R, Anderson. We called him John all of his life, or Johnny. I don't know where the name came from. He was born in Dexter, Missouri. And the rest of the family came from Kentucky, up through there somewhere, and settled on, at that time, what was known as the Big Swamp Land. 10-mile swamp, which had been caused or created by the New Madrid earthquakes about 1800. And boy, they were the world's greatest earthquakes. But it was a hell of a country for a young kid to grow up in. We had cotton fields to play in, and we had swamp lands and cypress trees that were 200 years old, some of them as big around as a house. And they would catch fire on the inside and burn out and hollow, and the swamp water was only about a foot deep, but it was a foot deep everywhere. So we'd get an old flatboat and swim into our special caves, and that was that. But anyway, that gives you some idea of how I grew up. And Dad and Mom, when they finally got together, built a little one-room house in Holcomb. And when I say one room, I mean one room, probably 25 foot square, a bed on one side, sewing machine on the other side, and a kitchen sink against the back wall, and a kitchen stove a few feet away. Now, years later, when we got prosperous, they actually put a partition between the two rooms. And when I was about 5, cardboard boxes and used that like wallpaper and covered up the entire house until it was as snug as a bug, except for the floor. If you dropped something on the floor, it invariably went through a crack, and you had to crawl under the house to get it out. And since the house was about 3 feet off the ground, it wasn't too difficult. It was always my job to do it. Now the question is, how is this recording? So I'm going to stop playing and listen to it and see. Well, I stopped playing and listened to it, and it wasn't too bad. So I just turned it back on and started recording again. We lived in that house off and on for, probably about 12 years. And it got a little bigger, and Mother finally got a sink put in the kitchen. Water in Missouri was only about 4 foot down in the ground. And Dad just cut a hole in the floor and drove a pipe right down, built a wooden trough and put a pump in it. And Mother, instead of having to walk about 15 feet out in the backyard, had water right in the kitchen. And no bride was ever happier. Not any bride today with her dishwasher and all that other jazz. Because, boy, she had running water. And all the stoves in those days, they heated on wood, but they had a big reservoir up on the end. And you load that with water, and probably held about 10 gallons. So you always had 10 gallons of hot water going. And that meant it's enough to do the dishes or even take a shower. Not a shower, but a tub bath. We had one big old tub, they called it a number 3 galvanized tub. And on Saturday night or Friday night, everybody got a tub bath. The smallest kid got the bath first, then the next kid, and then the next. And then that water got too cold and it was pouring out, and then Mother would take a shower, a bath, and then Dad would get the last tub. So we did get to bathe once a week. And oddly enough, in those days, that was considered not too healthy to wash all that dirt off, because it left you unprotected against the cold. And it got pretty damn cold, because the only thing you had to keep you warm was a wood-burning stove. And that didn't do the job all the time. It was my job to, at the end of the night when the fire went out, I would get in and put in paper in the oven and in the fire grate and kindling, and get it all set up so that in the morning all I had to do was strike a match and the fire would start burning. There was only one thing wrong. Once in a great while there would be a live coal, and the damn thing would start burning in the middle of the night, and then I'd have to wait and do it all over again. And that didn't make me happy or anybody else happy. But that's life. Now, we lived, I'd say that as a childhood, no kid today can ever know the joys of living in a small country town to the creek and catch 'em in your hands. And we tried all of 'em. I remember one we were going to barbecue it, but we forgot that they had guts in them. So we wrapped it up in mud, put it in the fire and baked it, and then started to eat it, guts and all. And what a stench. We were all throwing up. How's that for a story? But, and every time I'd head for the creek, Dad would always yell at me, "Now you stay out of that damn water till you learn how to swim." And I used to say, "Well, how am I going to learn how to swim if I don't get in the water?" He'd say, "There's plenty of time for you to find that out. You'll find out." And about that time, the Great Depression hit. In 1929, I was born in 21, and Joe was born in 28. No, Joe was born in 29. In the meantime, Billy had been born. Let's see, I was born in 21 on the 5th of September in 21. Billy was born 5 years later, so that would have made him born about 26. But he died of appendicitis. He fell off of an ironing board. Mother was ironing, had him on the ironing board, and she thought he just broke his back or something. But it wasn't. It was appendicitis and didn't have a damn thing to do with the fall. But by the time the little country doctor found it out, the closest hospital was Blytheville, 80 miles away, and the fastest way there was with a Model T car at 4 miles an hour. So they drove all day and all night, but by the time they got to Blytheville, little Billy had suffered a double appendicitis burst, and he died of peritonitis or something like that. And then, of course, we moved. Every time a baby was born, we'd move. We moved from there to Flint, Michigan. And in Flint, Michigan, 5 years later, Joe was born. In Flint, Dad worked for Pontiac, which Uncle Jack worked for. We lived with Uncle Jack and Aunt Julie. Incidentally, Dad was one of a whole big family. There was, the oldest would be Ray, and then Uncle Jack, and then Uncle Lewis. Called him Coon-Eye because he got in a fight, and a black eye made him look just like a coon. And then there was Dad and Aunt Kate and Aunt Neva and Aunt Beat. So that was a pretty good sized family. Now Dad had a twin brother, but he died as a baby. They were burning leaves in the backyard, and his gown got on fire. And to this day, nobody remembers what his name was. Even Dad didn't remember what his name was. So, there's a pretty big family, and they're all gone now except Aunt Beach. She must be about 85. Uncle Jack died just recently. He was 87. Uncle Ray died a few years before. And Aunt Kate, who was one of my favorites, she must have died way back about 1938. Anyway, when Joe was born, we left Flint and came back to Holcomb. And Dad opened up his hamburger joint again. And he was doing pretty good. And then on the morning of 29th of something. I don't remember the months. That's when the stock market went kaput. And we went to bed with money in the bank. And Aunt Louise, our Aunt Louise, was the bank president. But the following morning, she didn't even show up at the bank. It never opened again. So everybody that had money in it, farmers or merchants or whatever, that money was gone forever. And it just, if the bank held a mortgage on your property, they foreclosed the property, but they didn't give you anything on your own money. I'm going to have to stop and cough a minute. It is February the 28th, the last day of the month. 6:30 in the morning, the sun is setting in the, rising in the east. Another day, Friday. Anyway, as I said, when Joe was born, he was born in Flint, Michigan. And since I'm 8 years older than he is, I must have been 8 and he must have been 0, but that would have been 1929. And that's when the big bust happened, so we all moved back to Holcomb, Missouri, and moved in with Granddad Anderson. That was the year that Dad and Mother bid cotton for 15 cents 50 cents a 100-pound sack, and you made 50 cents. And Dad could pick about 300 and 350 pounds, and Mother pick about 100. And they saved up enough money to build a little building and open up a hamburger joint. And Dad could make the best damn hamburgers the world ever tasted. And of course they only cost a nickel. Onion, pickle, mustard, whatever you wanted. And people used to flock there. And I'm talking about flocking there. Holcomb only had 365 people. And I swear that on a Saturday night, each and every one of them ate at least 4 hamburgers. I can remember him coming home. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, he would come home and empty out sacks of nickels and dimes and pennies on the kitchen table. And sometimes he would be there an hour and a half counting it. And it looked like all the money in the world. But then, as you remember, in 1929, the Depression hit. The banks closed on Monday night and didn't open up again for several years. In fact, the one in Holcomb where we had our money never did open again. It sat there for my entire childhood. Just a vacant building with all those bars and grills and protective devices protecting old ledgers, but nothing else. Well, the hamburger business still made a living, but it didn't make much of a living because nobody had penny nickels. But it was better than nothing. And about that time, Johnny was born. Now, Johnny would have been about 5 years older than Joe, younger than Joe. His mom had a kid about every 5 years, it looked like. So this must have been about, I was 12. And Joe would have been 4, so Johnny must have been about 19. 1931. 29, yeah, about 1931. And it was about this time that Dad got the chance to trade the hamburger joint for 40 acres of farmland down around Frisbee, Missouri. Now this had all at one time been swampland, that is covered over with water, about 1.5 feet deep, so it was extremely rich. They called it black gumbo, and when it was wet or it rained and you stepped in it, you'd take about 2 steps and you'd have to stop and take a stick and pry the mud off of your shoes or you couldn't walk, it was so heavy. Well, anyway, he bought this and it had a single story, flat tin roof building on it with 3 rooms. A kitchen and the 2 rooms that we used alternately, one is a living room, bedroom, and the other one is strictly a bedroom with 2 beds in it for the boys. And it was fairly good size compared to what people lived in those days. And then it had a big barn. Because a farmer, the barn was more important than the house. We had 2 mules and a cow and a couple of pigs running around and a few chickens. And it was my job to take care of the livestock, as it was called. Each morning I'd have to get up and usually about 5 o'clock in the morning take a pail with a little warm water and go out to the shed in the barn, and the cow would have been tied up all night. I'd wash off her teats, sit out on a little stool and start milking her. And every now and then she'd kick me off the bucket. She'd swish her tail and hit you right in the face and you'd fall over backwards in the crap. And cuss her and call her all kinds of names, but little by little she'd give you a bucket of milk, and it was delicious. The stuff we buy in the stores today has no comparison to fresh milk right out of a cow. There is one problem. If the cow's out been eating bitter weeds or whatever she's been eating is what her milk is going to taste like. So if she's been eating sweet clover, the milk's going to be delicious. If she's been eating bitter weeds or any kind of weed with a foul taste, then the milk's going to be pretty foul tasting. But that milk you use for cooking. After milking, then it was my job to go out and pump a trough of water with a hand pump for the mules and the cow, and there was a small trough there for the pig. I filled that with water, and I would put out grain, corn, for the horses. I call them horses, they're really mules. And that usually took me about an hour and a half or 2 hours. Then I would go in the house, and Mother would have, Dad would already be sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that was just scalding. I couldn't even handle the cup, much less drink the coffee. And Mother would be cooking biscuits, and fire roaring in the stove. In the winter that was fine, but in the summer that wasn't too good because that fire made just as much heat in the summer as it did in the winter. In the winter everybody gathered around it. In the summer everybody just sweat run all off of you and you all stank because you still only took 1 bath a week. But we'd have breakfast. Usually by that time the sun had risen, and out to the barn and hitch up the mules to whatever we were going to do that day, or if we were going to plow or it's got blades on the edge, and it cuts all the scrub up into little pieces. Or you had a rake, which was a big size rake, and you stand in the middle of it, and the mules pull. Whatever we were going to hook it up to, that's what we'd hook it up to that day. And you'd go to work, and you'd work right up until 12 noon. Then as you got closer to the house, you'd stop, and or if you bought a lunch, you'd stop and eat your lunch, a sandwich usually, and you'd have a bucket of water that you carried with you all the time. And then it was a half hour for lunch, and then back to work until dark. And by the time you got dark, you went home. And you didn't waste any time. Mothers have dinner ready, and you eat dinner and go right to bed. But that farm life then was about the hardest life in the whole damn world. Today it's all done by machines, but then it was all done by humans. And I swear, we only lived 1 year on the farm, and if we'd lived there any longer, I think I would have jumped in the river. And we did have a little ditch that ran right through the middle of the farm. And every winter that thing would overflow, and up about on the banks about a couple hundred yards. But in the summertime the water was dirty, but it was cool, and you could jump in, and that wasn't considered bathing, but it did get some of the crud off of you. You could jump in there and cool yourself off, and there was some fish in it. So I'd sit down there with the fish. Johnny developed pneumonia about that time, and let's see, that's the only way I remember their deaths and their births is going back to my own age. I was about 14, 13, so that would have been about 1929, 13, 1933. So I was about 12. Johnny developed pneumonia, and Mother sent me into Holcomb to get the doctor. Well, it was a 4-mile walk, and old Doc Smith, the only one that we had. And in those days, they had no treatment for pneumonia other than Vicks vapor. You'd heat some Vicks and build a little tent around the baby's face and let them breathe it. Whereas today a shot of penicillin and it's all cured. Then pneumonia was pretty much a 50-50 chance. And if you got double pneumonia, that is in the other lung, why, you were a goner. Well, by the time I walked into Holcomb and got the doctor, and he hitched up his buggy. Remember, there still were no cars by then, not in the small towns. He hitched up his buggy, and we made it back to the farm, and by the time we got there, I remember walking in the door, and Mother sitting in a rocking chair with the baby hugged up to her, just bawling her eyes out. And it was too late. Little Johnny was dead. Well, of course, as I said earlier, whenever a baby died, we moved. So we weren't long in getting off that farm. Dad traded the farm to a man in Rector, Arkansas, which was only about 14 miles away. He traded the farm for a beer joint, a place that sold nothing but beer and sandwiches. And it was called the Bloody Bucket, so that's how and when we moved to Rector, Arkansas. to Missouri and work up to rector. Missouri was a very small town. It was 365 people. We'll see if we do a little recording here. As I left you on the other side, I was in Hawkham, growing up as a pool hustler, playing pool using the Budweiser beer kegs to stand on. And that's the only way I could do it, but I got to be pretty good. So by the time I was 10 or 11, I could beat most of the farmers in town. In fact, I could beat most of the players in town. So my youth is pretty well misspent. I studied, did well in school, because if I didn't do well in school, Dad took a razor strap to me. In my day in school, the principal first he'd paddle you, then he'd tell your dad, and then your dad would beat the hell out of you with his razor strap. So you kind of walked a tightrope. But in the meantime, I had one best friend whose name was Bage, B-A-G-E, it's an unusual name, Bage Harper. And he lived in a big old unfinished house, two-story house that had been started when Prosperity was there. And they had a cane break. That's a whole field of fishing poles that just grows so straight and so solid that if you get in between them, it would take a posse of months to find you. And we'd get out there and hollow out little nests and have our secret hiding places. And boy, we'd have a ball. And there was only one thing with Bage. He was bigger than I was. And every afternoon after school, he'd beat the hell out of me. So I took that for about 2 years. And one day I picked up a brickbat and waited for him to come out the front door of the school. And just as he came out, I clobbered him over the head with a brickbat. And he went down bleeding like a stuck pig. And from that moment on, we never did have another fight. We were just good friends. To this day, I don't have any idea. The last I heard, he was in Cleveland, Ohio. But he had a brother, Spencer, who was older, and he committed suicide. And he had a couple of other brothers, and I don't know what happened to them. And I had a lot of girls. I could go down the street. The main street of Hawkham had about 3 blocks of concrete sidewalk, leading from the bank down past Hostetler's grocery store, out to the mayor's house. And that was about 3 blocks, and that's all. The rest of it was just dirt roads and dirt paths. And Uncle Jack was the chief of all trades. He was a notary public, the mayor, the Baptist preacher. He had a little place where he did shoe repair. I doubt if he ever made more than $5 a week. But he raised a family of about 10 kids on it and did all right. But he was a wheel. And every time all the other brothers came into town, they'd go over to the Baptist church and get all the chairs out of there, the pews, and have a picnic in Uncle Jack's yard. Well, I went to school in Hawkham to the 8th grade. I graduated the 8th grade there. And I gave a speech and won a silver medal. I gave Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. some of it. And everybody was so proud, but Dad couldn't come, and that broke my heart. He said he had to be at the hamburger joint making money. And he did. After the thing lit out, everybody headed there for hamburgers. Dad didn't show much love and affection. He had it, and every time he'd pat me on the back, I would just glow. But he was not a kissing father or a hugging father. In fact, in my youth, very few of them were. They just didn't show affection to you. So that's what that was all about. Pansy's coming into the room now with a tray full of something I'm supposed to eat, and I don't have any idea what the hell it is. So I'm going to cut this off momentarily. Well, I had my breakfast or my dinner. Pansy brought it in. That's pretty good, so it's time to start talking again. Anyway, that's pretty much the way things went in my childhood. I'd go to school. At lunch, I'd walk down to the hamburger joint. It's on the block. Dad would give me a Coke and a hamburger and a Hershey bar. Back to school. After school, Harper and I would take off for the ditch or the cane break or whatever. And we stay out sometimes until midnight. Nobody worried about you because there just wasn't anything for you to get in trouble with. Steal a watermelon in the summer, green apples in the winter. And at that time, the Frisco train came in from St. Louis once a day, and the postman would hitch up two donkeys he had to a little red wagon and make the 4-block trot down to the depot. We kids would be hanging on the tailgate of the wagon. He'd pick up the mail, come back to the post office, and the Frisco would turn around and go back. It looked kind of like a Tunaville ferry. A little red car. Somewhere around closing time, between 9 o'clock and midnight, I'd go home. And in those days, you know, in little towns like Holcomb, there were no electric lights. Everybody lived by lamplight. Even the restaurant, Dad's hamburger joint, had lamplights, lanterns hanging. And God damn, the mosquitoes would just eat you up. They used to say that those things were big enough to haul away a cow. And I swear I believe it. A good-sized cow at that. So that's pretty much the way it went. I was a favorite kid. Everybody liked me. There's Rosie fixing to go bowling.
See you later.
Okay, honey. Bye-bye. And I remember when I was about 3 years old, when Billy was born, I was the only one of the whole family that was born in the hospital. All the rest of them were born in a home, which is where almost everybody was in those days. Mother got pregnant, and they would rub camphor or some foul-smelling stuff on her stomach to keep the muscles from stretching too much, and it always smelled to high heaven. I believe it was camphor. And they woke me up about midnight and says, "Wake up, Bobby, walk down to Aunt Louise's," which was a half a block away. And they dressed me, and I walked down there, and they were waiting for me. When I woke up the next morning, and they brought me home, and I have a little baby brother named Billy. And he was the first one to be born after me time or another. And then we'd live there for a year or two and then come back to Holcomb. That was about this time that Dad opened up another hamburger joint. I brought back the one he'd had before. And then little Johnny. Now let's see. Joe was born next, I guess. Joe was born when we lived in Flint. That's what it was. And we moved back to Holcomb. So Joe and Jim don't remember too much about Holcomb. That's when Dad traded the hamburger joint for the farm. And Johnny was born on the farm and died on the farm. And that's when, as I said, we moved to Rector. Now you have to remember, Holcomb had been about 365 people. And Rector was over 3,000, so that was a hell of a big city for a country boy like me. And they had electric lights in the pool hall and everywhere. Well, boy, that was really true, the first real house that we had. It had two bedrooms, a living room, and a separate kitchen and a back porch with a pump on it and a sink. So it was really a pretty good sized house. And we had an old radio, cabinet style, and it had a light in it and a linoleum floor. I'll never forget that. Boy, I'd lay on that floor in the wintertime and try to read by the light of that radio. And we had a coal-burning stove with what they call an isinglass window. And man, that was the coziest place I'd ever been in my whole damn life. But the first thing I did was make a fast retreat to the pool hall. Well, they had a law that you couldn't go in unless you were 18 without permission of your dad. Well, my dad says, hell, I'll give him permission. In fact, you guys you'd be taking all your money, you'd probably be wanting to kick him out. And sure enough, I made nothing but money shooting pool there. I was a hot shot. If I couldn't beat him with my stick, I beat him with my mouth. I was a wise guy. I talk them out of their money. So we lived in Rector, and that's where Joe was born. Or not Joe, Jim. Jim was born at Rector, Arkansas. And about that time, times got rough and I had to quit high school. I finished the 9th grade and was going to go to the 10th grade, but you had to buy your own books in those days, and nobody had any money to buy books with. Not in the Anderson family, anyway. Dad had been out of work for years. He was in Michigan. And one night, when I was about 13, I got a wild bug up my butt to catch a freight train and go to Michigan. I don't know whatever gave me the idea, but with a sack of bull down at about 20 cents, the Cotton Belt Flyer came through. That was the name of the train. It went from Texarkana, Arkansas to St. Louis, and I got on that thing. And in those days, there were thousands and thousands of people riding them, not just bums. Well well-respected men looking for work anywhere. And everywhere I went, they were helping me. We got into St. Louis, and I didn't have any idea which way. There were just thousands of trains, and I didn't know which one would go to Detroit was where I wanted to go. And some old hobos got me on one. He says, that'll take you to Cleveland. And from Cleveland, you catch one to Toledo. And then you head right into Detroit. Well, after about 4 or 5 days of riding freight trains, they all burned coal in those days, and I was just as black as a nigger. They didn't call them black people then, they called them niggers. And I was black. But this train yard stopped on Woodard Avenue in Detroit. And it just so happened that Aunt Beach's house was on a street about a mile from there, right off of Woodard. And I hitchhiked a ride and got there and knocked on her door. And she came to the door, and as I said, I looked like a black boy. And she said, what do you want, nigger? I said, I ain't no nigger, I'm your Bobby Anderson. And she yelled, she said, Homer, come and look at this. It's Bobby Anderson. And they bathed me, give me a bath. Right away sent a telegram to Mama that I was all right. And Dad was out at Novi, Michigan, which was about 50 miles away. And they jumped in the car and drove me out there. It was after midnight. And he didn't know whether to beat the hell out of me or to laugh. And he was going to do both. And Beach said, why, this kid's missing you so badly that he rode a freight train all the way from Rector to see you. Now, Johnny, you take care of this boy and you feed him and you get him back home and go back home with him. And damned if Dad didn't do that. And that's the end of tonight's conversation. Well, up to this point, I've just pretty much rambled around. Yeah, Bernie's going to say something first.
Okay. Now, if Roseanne comes home, say 12 or so,
as I said, up to this point, I've pretty much rattled around. But now I'm going to back up and try to put it in chronological order. And since I don't have to spell it, you'll have to look it up in the dictionary. I was born in 1921. Calvin Coolidge was the first president, and he was president when I was born. Shortly after that, Herbert Hoover was elected president. He's the only one I remember. I don't remember Calvin, but Silent Cal, as they called him, he said that his one great statement was that you take a man who is unemployed, and that means he doesn't have any job. And that's the greatest source of unemployment in the United States today. Anyway, I was born in 1921, and I grew up, born in Kennett, Missouri. Mother and Dad were both, at those days and age, pretty well educated. Dad had went to Chillicothe Business College in Chillicothe, Missouri, and Mother had graduated from high school in Kennett, Missouri, at a day and age when most kids only went to the 5th or 6th grade. So they set out to educate their son. Now, in my youth, we had no electricity. said, we had this one-room house. Now, in 1921, 2 years later, Billy Anderson was born. And he was born right there in the house, and I remember Mother or Dad or somebody getting me up in the middle of the night and saying, walk down the street to Aunt Louisa's, and she'll put you up. And when I came home the next morning, I had a little baby brother. And I adored him from the start. But when he was about 3-4 years old, he developed appendicitis, and by the time they got him to the hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, which was 80 miles away, and the only way to get there was in a Model T Ford, why he died of double pneumonia, or double ruptured appendicitis. And then we moved from there to, let's see, the next one born would have been Johnny. Or the next one, the next one was Joe. Yeah. We moved from there to Flint, Michigan, where we stayed with Aunt Julie and Uncle Ray. And Dad worked at the Pontiac plant. About everybody in that day and age worked for Ford, because Ford had come out with a $5 a day plan. You worked all day long and you got $5 a day, which in those days was revolutionary. Then to go and drop back home was 15 cents an hour for picking cotton or gathering corn or working on a farm. But Joe was born in Flint, Michigan, and when he was a couple of years old, we moved back to Holcomb, back to the same house we had before. They never did sell the house, they just locked it up. You really didn't have to lock anything up because nobody had locks on the doors. And that summer, Mom and Dad went out and picked cotton and earned enough picking cotton to buy this little building and put in a hamburger joint. And Dad was a hell of a hamburger cooker. He could cook up a hamburger for a nickel that would just melt in your mouth. And I swear on a weekend they would come from 40 miles around to buy his hamburgers. And in the meantime, let's see, I got over and I was the pride and joy. I was the first grandson, so everybody called me Bobby, little Bobby Anderson. And Aunt Beat was the youngest of the brothers and sisters, and she thought I was a teddy bear, and she was forever buying me something. I don't know where she got the money, but she always did buy me something. And Mother, of course, spent all of her time taking care of me. And I used to lay on the floor and look through the cracks, and at night I had a little baby bed right by the window, and I could look out and see the stars. So I was never raised in fear. There was nothing to be afraid of. And we did very good in the hamburger joint until the stock market went kaput. See, there was no warfare in those days. There was no charity. money, you depended on your neighbors. They'd give you an old pair of run-down socks or shoes or a free meal, and maybe somebody even slip you a dime, but most people were just about as broke as the others, so there wasn't any great tragedy. And then Herbert Hoover lost the election to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That was in 1932, and the country stock market went broke in 1929, and all the banks closed up. And I remember I had about 23 cents in Aunt Louise's bank, because the school kids had been taught in those days that a penny saved is a penny earned. And once a week they'd take us down to the bank with our bank books, and we'd put in a penny or 2 pennies. And I had the magnificent sum of about 26 cents. And that was my first big loss in the bank business. And shortly after that, let's see, it was Johnny was born, I guess. What was Johnny born? Johnny was born in Holcomb also. And he was born, and then Dad got a chance to trade the farm, or the hamburger joint, for a 40-acre farm, which was a hell of a deal. And he traded that for the farm, and we moved to the farm. And that was, I had graduated the 8th grade in Holcomb, and gave a speech there as the class president or whatever. And I gave Gettysburg Address and won a silver medal for it. And Dad couldn't come because he was busy selling hamburgers. But Mother was so tickled. And we moved out to this farm, and the farm was almost like a shoebox. It was like you take 4 shoeboxes and put them side by side. One of them had a kitchen, and 2 of them were used for bedrooms, and one of them was used to had a stove in it. In those days, you didn't have heat in every room. You just had one stove, and you put that stove in the room where everybody was going to sit and gather around it. And onions and potatoes and vegetables that would freeze outside were put underneath the bed. And every now and then I know that my bed had potatoes under it. And you'd get a rotten potato under there, and boy, you'd have to get in there and root that thing out because it would just stink like hell. Well, little Billy, or little Johnny rather, contracted pneumonia, and I came home one day from school, I went to the consolidated school in Holcomb, and I'd have to walk 4 miles down a country road, catch a school bus, and ride that 4 miles, and then I was at school. And when I got home, Mother told me to take off after the doctor, so it was back on the 4-mile walk, and running and walking and running and walking, and ran into Holcomb and got Doc Smith. He hooked up his buggy, but by the time we got back to the farm, Mother was sitting there crooning to a dead baby, rocking away with little Johnny hugged up against his shoulder, but he'd been dead for a couple hours. Cemetery in Norfolk, Missouri. Pine Lawn was a cemetery that had one little pine tree there, and for some reason they called it Pine Lawn. And you didn't have to buy the land. The neighbors would dig the hole and lay the body out in the living room. Uncle Jack usually made the casket. He was a carpenter. And he was a little bit of everything.